Okay, so on this episode of the Leadersmith podcast, we're going to be talking to Craig von Busick. Craig is someone that I kind of knew, kind of didn't. We were at Regent University at about the same time back in the late 90s. And we kind of crossed paths, but I haven't talked to him in like a decade or more. And he just wrote a book recently about Ulysses S. Grant, and it's going to be fascinating. Stay tuned.
You are listening to The Leadersmith, Darren Curtis.
Okay, so Craig, welcome to the show. I'm glad that you could be here.
Well, thank you, Darren. It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so you wrote this book on Ulysses S. Grant, and I'm curious why him. I mean, you could write on anyone, and he usually gets short shrift compared to like Lee, right? So why Grant? What is it about Grant that drew you to the subject?
Well, the reason that he gets short shrift is because of what was known as the Lost Cause School.
Mhm.
And those were a group of academics, historians, and writers who were pro-Confederate. And they were embarrassed that the planter class had pulled the South into a war that basically destroyed the South. And it was all over the issue of slavery. Now, the Lost Cause School would say, oh, no, it was about tariffs, or no, it was about states' rights. Well, it would only be about states' rights because of slavery. It was only
Right,
about
right. And
tariffs because of cotton and slavery.
That's right. I've said the same thing for years, right? I mean, it was about states' rights, but it was about states' rights because they wanted to defend that institution. So, yes, but there's more to the story. You know,
Yeah.
Hitler
And
was a vegetarian, but that's not where the story ends.
exactly correct. And
Right.
really, when you study the motives of the leaders of the South, not only did they want slavery to go to the entire United States, but they wanted to build an empire of slavery that would go into Mexico, Central America, and South America.
Mhm.
And so it was, you know, there's a few different things that happened, but basically, the Lost Cause writers said we need to bring Ulysses S. Grant down and we need to raise Robert E. Lee up. We need to do that because Grant had such a powerful impact, not only in the war, but as president. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was raised and when I grew up in school, I was told that Grant was the second worst president that we ever had.
Now, this is one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you too, because Grant had such a terrible reputation. And if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're saying is that this is like modern spin, right? Where it's not really about the facts, it's about the narrative that they want to push on people. And that's what was happening with the Lost Cause School.
That's exactly correct. To be honest, if you look at things from a fair standpoint, going in with no mind in the matter, I believe that you would come out saying Grant was one of our most important presidents
Hmm.
because he kept the country afloat during those very dangerous and difficult times after the Civil War. But not only that, he pushed through the anti KKK laws, he pushed through the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which basically granted all of the rights that were eventually restored in the Civil Rights Act of 1864. And we had to have the entire civil rights movement in order to restore what Grant had pushed through as president in 1875. Sadly, the Supreme Court overturned that law, and that opened the door to
Okay.
80 years of terror that we call Jim Crow racism.
So I definitely want to come to that. I want to go back a step though between Grant and Lee first. And like, so I've read about Lee, like he was no slouch. I mean,
No, he was a
he
great
was an
general.
excellent leader. Um, and Abraham Lincoln by Sandberg. I remember distinctly. I'm pretty sure that's the source. I remember distinctly that what was the first Union commander? Scott. Scott said that Lee
Winfield Scott.
was worth 10,000 men. So Lee was something significant in his own right. And you're saying that Grant was as good or perhaps better because I've got this
This is
kind
an
of cave
argument that
dweller.
and a debate that goes on and on and on. I will give you my perspective. There's no question that Robert E. Lee was a brilliant commander, and Lincoln offered him command of all the armies at the beginning of the Civil War. And I think that Lee made an awful decision and a
Mhm.
terrible mistake by turning that down. What he said was, "I cannot raise my sword against my
Right.
own country." Uh, Sometimes he would use the word native state.
Mhm.
But we need to realize that back then they looked at the states as countries. There was the nation in their mind of South Carolina, the nation of Virginia,
Right.
and they were brought together in the Union for mutual defense because they needed to defend themselves. They couldn't defend themselves individually. They knew that against European, the Spanish or the French or the British, but also for trade. But in many of their minds, and remember that Robert E. Lee was the son of Light Horse Harry Lee,
Right.
which was George Washington's one of his chief lieutenants. And in the minds of those colonial people, they thought that going into the Union voluntarily, they could voluntarily get out of the Union.
Mhm.
And so Robert E. Lee followed his native state. And that was, I think, one of the worst decisions that he could have made. And that's what Grant said in his memoirs. He said, "I have great respect for those who fought against us, but I think that their cause was one of the worst causes that anyone has ever fought for, and that is slavery." And Grant
Yeah.
came right out and said very clearly, "We know that this war was about slavery." So, getting back to your question, um, while Lee was a great commander, we need to realize that Lee never took the surrender of any army. Grant received
Huh.
3 army surrenders: Fort Donelson, Vicksburg, and of Robert E. Lee himself.
Yeah.
Not only that, but Grant, when he was promoted to be the lieutenant general, which was a rank that only George Washington had ever had, the Congress and Abraham Lincoln saw the victories that Grant had had throughout the West, and they realized we need our best guy to go up against their best guy in the East.
Right.
But he was not only the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Actually, George Meade remained the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Grant was over all of the armies, more than 1 million men.
Mhm.
And so what, people say, well, Grant was a butcher and he just won by pounding down the
Right.
South.
That's the nature of my question, because I have always understood Grant to be just this knuckle dragger that it was just a war of attrition, not a great
Yeah,
tactician like Lee.
yeah, that's lost cause gospel.
Wow.
And so, but when you look at what Grant did, he was able to defeat the South using exactly the same resources that the 6 commanders had before him. But what was the difference? The difference was that he came in and he said, "We will fight them separately to defeat them separately." Up until that point, they would allow certain parts of one army to go and of the Confederate Army to go and resupply and shore up the other parts of the army.
Yeah.
And so, whenever there was an emergency, the Confederates would send different parts of their army to different places, and the Yankees didn't do anything to stop that. So that was number one. Number two, he said, "We're going to fight them every day, and there will be no stopping." Whereas every other commander before Grant, you'd fight a battle, then you'd retreat, you'd reform, you'd resupply, you'd lick your wounds, you'd bring in some new soldiers, and then 3 or 4 months later, you'd fight another battle. And Grant said, "No, we're going to fight, and we're going to fight, and we're going to fight every day, and we're not going to let them go." And that's why he said after Spotsylvania, he sent a note to Stanton, who was the Secretary of War, who gave it to Lincoln. And Grant said, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." Well, it took all summer, all fall,
Mhm.
and all winter, and then most of the spring. But in the end, he finally won. The other thing that Grant did that was also vitally important is that he stopped the prisoner exchanges, because he said, "Why do we want to give them back healthy soldiers that we could keep in prison?" Yes, we lose our soldiers to their prisons, but we have an endless supply of new people that we could bring in to reinforce our armies. But for them, every person that's wounded or killed, that shrinks their army one at a time, one at a time, one at a time. And so he cut off the supply. And then the final aspect, not only of Grant's strategy, but it was Lincoln's, and you had mentioned Winfield Scott's strategy, and that was the Anaconda plan. Grant had always agreed with that, and that was to cut off all trade all the way around in every harbor and up the Mississippi River. And so Grant continued with that policy and even pushed it further by destroying all of the ports. And Wilmington was the final battle that shut down the final port. And after the Wilmington Harbor battle, families were writing to their loved ones in the armies saying, "You must come home. We're starving to death. We're going to die without you." And so from the election of Abraham Lincoln through March, when the army started to fight again, there was, I don't remember the exact, it's in the book, but it was something like a 35% drop by soldiers who were leaving without leave from the armies because they had to go home and take care of their families. And so all of that strategy together, combined with the pounding, yes, he did believe in the war of attrition, but in addition to all these other things. And so it's one of the things that when you're having this debate, you have to say, Lee had a strategy and he fought in Virginia. Grant fought in the entire continent and had a strategy for the entire continent. And then the final thing is, people call Grant a butcher, but there's a strategy or a researcher named Edward Bonekemper, and he did a exhaustive analysis, and actually percentage-wise, Lee had higher casualties than
Really?
Grant did. Yeah.
Wow, I have been duped by the propaganda, and I have a newfound respect for Grant after 10 minutes talking to you. And I'm pretty sure it's only going to get better by the end of this interview. I'm really, really amazed. Okay, so you've already sold me that as a military strategist, he was as good, perhaps better than Lee. Okay, I'm already convinced. Tell me about him as a young man first, like, because I've also read about, he was kind of lousy businessman and barely making ends meet, and then went back into the army and found his genius in the army. Is that propaganda or is that legit?
It's a mixture, but it's more propaganda than legit.
Okay, tell me about it.
There are a couple things that are part of the propaganda that are also true. So they come out of a little bit of truth, but then they are twisted to fit their narrative. And so the truth of the matter is that Ulysses S. Grant was an alcoholic.
Okay.
Now they call him a drunk, and they said he was not much of a soldier. That's total falsehood. He was a hero in the Mexican American War. He put his life on the line several times in a very heroic fashion. He was considered one of the best quartermasters in the entire army. And so he had been shipped out west after the Mexican War in the early 1850s to be a quartermaster out there. And unfortunately, that was before there was the Transcontinental Railroad.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was not able to take his wife and his two small children with him.
Sure.
And the army pay was so low that he felt hopeless. So he tried all kinds of different schemes. It wasn't that he was not a smart businessman, although he was not a businessman. So that part of it is true, but he worked hard. Okay. And he did come up with some good ideas. They just didn't work out. So for example, he planted potatoes, but that year there was a huge thaw of the snow in the mountains and it flooded the potatoes. And that was the end of that. He invested in a restaurant in San Francisco, and the guy took the money and ran, and that was the end of that. He invested in bringing ice down on a steamship from Alaska to San Francisco, and on the way, the steamship broke down and the ice melted, and that was the end of that. So when these schemes fell apart, he was depressed being away from his wife, and he started to drink. And unfortunately, he was an alcoholic. With the disease of alcoholism, when you start to bend your elbow, you don't stop. And so he was caught a couple of different times being drunk on duty, and his commander said, "You have a choice of either, resigning or being court-martialed." And he couldn't imagine being court-martialed, so he resigned.
Mm.
He went back to St. Louis, where his wife was from, and her father gave him several acres of land and a slave. So Grant actually owned a slave at one point. So did his wife. She owned several, to work this land. He worked very diligently. He was actually quite smart as a farmer, but unfortunately, there was one of the first Great Depressions, financial depressions that hit
Right.
right when he was farming his land.
So this
And
was like 1830s or 40s, right?
this was the 1850s, between
1850s. Okay.
1853 and the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. And
Okay.
so he, it wasn't for lack of work. In fact, a lot of times you'll hear people describe Grant as being stoop shouldered. Well, the reason was that he worked on a farm and he was constantly, bending over, constantly lifting heavy loads, and it caused a permanent change in his shoulders. It wasn't that he was
Wow.
a person. It was because he worked so hard that this
Yeah.
took place.
But
So at any
but
rate, after
couldn't
the
make it
farm
work.
went bad, he tried to do real estate, and the problem with that was that he was called on to collect rents, and Grant had been through such difficulty himself. He had a hard time being tough with the with the people not paying their rent. So in that, it was more that he was a man of compassion and not a businessman, as you pointed out.
Yeah.
So in the end, he was reduced to selling firewood in St. Louis, and finally, he and his wife said, Grant's father owned a chain of leather goods stores throughout the Midwest, and he had constantly been asking Grant to come and work for him. And Grant finally said, "I think, like the prodigal son, we need to go back." But this was also 1859, just before the outbreak of the Civil War, when the slavery issue was just causing an explosion in America.
Mhm.
Grant was at his lowest place financially. He could have sold that slave, made $1,000, which was a lot of money in 1859.
Mhm.
But instead, he gave that slave his freedom.
Wow.
And I believe that that shows that something was going on inside of Grant's heart. He saw that this was and later he came right out and said, "I saw slavery as a growing cancer that was destroying our country." And
Mm.
so I think he didn't want to be a part of it. And so he let that slave go free. He went up to Galena, Illinois, and he worked for his father's leather goods store. He was a good worker, but his heart wasn't in it because I think his eye was recognizing there's a war coming and I need to be ready. And so it was difficult for him to get back into the army because a lot of the people in power, either they went to the South,
Mhm.
a lot of the best generals went to the Confederacy,
Mhm.
or they said, "Well, Grant's a drunk. We don't want him." And they convinced Governor Yates in Illinois not to bring him on. But Grant went in and volunteered well, he was hired to be a mustering officer, which is the lowest of the low.
Wow.
And yet he did it with diligence. He answered questions. And eventually, Governor Yates realized this is a quality person. He named him Colonel. Fremont saw that he was a very valuable soldier. And so he named him Brigadier General just about 6 months later. And the rest is history.
Wow, so that's amazing. And there's a parallel here that I see that just because of where I've been as well. So my dissertation was on the leadership assumptions of the founding fathers. The founding fathers as a group were all terrible businessmen, but their genius in government is unbelievable. And I
Right.
think this is kind of what's going on with Grant. His genius in the military, in the battlefield, in that situation is unbelievable, but his aptitude, not aptitude, like he ran into a bunch of bad things, but it just wasn't his thing. The founding fathers were all great as lawyers and politicians, but they
Right.
were terrible businessmen. And I think we're seeing the
You're
same.
absolutely correct. And one of the things that this book focuses on uh, is the last 2 years of or not one of the things. The thing that this book focuses on is the last 2 years in Grant's life, and that all happens after he leaves the White House and he joins with his son, who had started an investment firm on Wall Street, but they joined with a man named Ferdinand Ward, who ended up being a complete shyster
And it
and
would
was running a giant Ponzi scheme.
right.
And it became one of the biggest Wall Street disasters in American history. So again, Grant was not a businessman,
Yeah.
um, and it caused pain for him earlier in his life, and then it caused pain again at the end. But what Grant did was he said, "Okay, I have run out of money," or he was basically bankrupt. He had $80 to his name, and so he didn't know how he was going to make money. But then, not long after that, he was diagnosed with incurable throat cancer.
Hmm.
So now he's dying and bankrupt, and he needs to make sure that he takes care of his wife. Many people had asked him to write his memoirs, and he never wanted to do it. He was born or raised a good Methodist. You don't talk about yourself, you don't raise yourself up, you don't attack other people, which is what a lot of these other memoirs did.
Hmm.
But now this is the only way that he can make money. And so he ended up partnering with his good friend, Mark Twain, who was a publisher at that time, and spent the last year of his life writing his memoirs. He finished 4 days before he died.
Right.
And the
It was
memoirs went on to be the second bestseller of the 19th century
it,
and made for his wife $450,000, which in today's money is more than $10 million. So in the end, he certainly redeemed himself
yeah.
and redeemed his reputation.
It was throat cancer or something from cigar smoke, right? Or
Well, we have to now, with our scientific understanding, we now can conjecture that it was most likely from his smoking cigars. He actually preferred the pipe,
okay.
but he had forgotten his pipe during the Battle of Fort Donelson, and a friend lent him a cigar. And so during that battle, the reporters saw him with this cigar, and so there was a sketch of him and description of him smoking calmly his cigar during the battle. And so after he won Fort Donelson, which was the first big major
Yeah.
Union victory, people from all over the country sent him cigars. So he had cigars for the rest of his life. So he changed from a pipe to cigars. And sadly, that gift probably is what killed him.
Yeah. Okay. So you went all the way to the end. I want to kind of incrementally work through.
Sure.
So we talked about his young man business failures. So he finds he gets the lowest of the low kind of position, and he's elevated very quickly. Tell me about him as a leader broadly, both militarily and politically. Just how was he as a leader, just in broad brushstrokes?
Well, my publisher asked me to write a second book, a companion book to the biography, and that's coming out the end of May. And that book is called Forward: The Leadership Principles of Ulysses S. Grant.
Wow.
And so in that, I look at some of the key principles that he carried in his life that brought him success. And you and I went to Regent University, and it was drummed into our head servant leadership.
Mhm.
And if you were to hold up a picture next to Abraham Lincoln of someone in American history that espoused servant leadership, it would be Ulysses S. Grant.
But that
He,
never would have crossed my mind.
he
Like that.
absolutely was.
Yeah. Tell me how, why, explain that and give evidence for that claim.
Before Grant, the other commanders of the Army of the Potomac included people like Hooker, Joseph Hooker, and George McClellan,
Yeah.
and a couple other Pope, General Pope. All of them were braggarts. McClellan especially, but also Hooker, were unbelievably insubordinate to Abraham Lincoln and disrespectful to Abraham Lincoln. And all of them had this propensity to see themselves as being the smaller army and constantly needing more supplies, more horses, more men.
Mm.
In reality, we know that the Army of the Potomac usually was at least a quarter to half larger than the
Mhm.
Army of Northern Virginia. And yet they had convinced themselves that it was the opposite. Ulysses S. Grant would send a list of requests. This started when he was out west, and he, as he started to move up the ladder after Fremont recognized his abilities. Fremont, by the way, was the commander of the Western forces at the beginning of the Civil War, and he had been the Republican candidate for president against Buchanan, the first Republican candidate. but he saw this skill in Grant. And so when he promoted him, Grant would send a list of what he requested. And then whatever was sent to him, he would say, okay, that's what I've got to work with. Let's go to work. He wouldn't complain. He wouldn't ask for more troops. He wouldn't ask for more supplies. He would take what was given him and he would employ those things. So that was one thing that Lincoln was like, he's amazing. I mean, I can't even believe it. In fact, Lincoln got really generous with Grant because he was like, this guy's so different than McClellan and Hooker. I want to just lavish stuff on him. And so they truly did in the Overland campaign. It was extravagance. They had more than they could even use. So that was one thing. Also, Grant was a very democratic leader. So he would be more in the line of the Deming model of leadership style 100 years before Deming, 120 years before 80 years before for Deming. So Grant did not put on airs. He dressed in a private's uniform. The only way you could know that he was a general were the stars on his shoulders. That was it. He was a dust-covered man on a dust-covered horse. He would lead the troops. Now, when he became lieutenant general, then it was not appropriate for him to be out front. In Shiloh, he was right out front. He actually got shot, but it hit his sword scabbard and it kept him from being killed. There was a reporter standing next to him at one point during the first day of Shiloh, and they're talking, and all of a sudden that man's head got blown off by a cannonball. Wow. Only feet away from Grant. So at Shiloh, Grant was in the battle. Now, once he became lieutenant general, then that you had to lead from behind because you were the strategist. Lee was the same way. Every time Lee wanted to go to the front, his soldiers would actually grab his horse and pull him back away from the battle. But what Grant would do is he would, in the mess tent, he wouldn't sit at the head of the table. He'd just sit anywhere. And he looked just like them. And most of the time, Grant they called him the Sphinx because he thought a lot, but he didn't talk a lot. And so he would sit there and he'd listen to all the conversation. And then he'd have a zinger every once in a while. And when he did say something, it was always with a punch. But whenever there was a major issue and a major decision, he would throw it out there to his staff and say, what do you guys think? And they would have these debates. And Grant would sit back with his cigar and just listen. Now, he would make the decision. And when he made the decision, it was his. But it was very much in a book called Campaigning with Grant by Horace Porter, who was one of Grant's top aides. He described in detail these meetings and these debates and how Grant operated. And he said it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. The other thing about Grant was that he was an amazing strategist. And so it looked like he was the laziest man in the army because he'd sit in the opening of his tent and just smoke or whittle and just sit there. But what he was doing is he was fighting the battle in his head before he ever gave the orders to fight the battle. And he did that every single time, to the point where when Grant got ill and he was dying of throat cancer, he went into a time where it was true depression, that where he realized he was dying. And he just sat there and just kind of stared off at the wall. And William Tecumseh Sherman came to visit. And Julia Grant, Ulysses' wife, was just saying, this is not like him. I don't understand. And Sherman said, mark my words. This is exactly what he did during the war. What he's doing is he's planning his memoirs. And he'll come out of it and he will win because that's Ulysses S. Grant. And it happened exactly that way. And so he was an amazing leader, really.
Sherman knew Grant pretty well. I remember a quote about something like, he stayed by me when I was crazy and I stayed by him when he was drunk, or something, vice versa. I don't remember.
Exactly correct.
Yeah.
That is a direct quote.
Yeah.
And now we support each other always was the end of it.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, after the Battle of Shiloh, the first day was almost, it was pretty much a Confederate victory. And fortunately, the Union was able to stop I think they pushed them back a mile and a half. The Confederates pushed the Union back a mile and a half and almost to the Tennessee River. But Grant and the leaders were able to finally stop them there. And they knew that they were having reinforcements that were coming from General Buell. And so that night it was raining, and Grant went to every commander and said, as soon as it's light, we attack. And Sherman heard this and thought, are you out of your mind? We need to go across the river and retool and lick our wounds and then figure out what we're going to do from there. So he's coming over to see Grant, and it's like 11 o'clock at night. Grant had actually tried to go into his headquarters, but they had made it into a hospital. And they're cutting off arms and legs left and right. There's a stack of bloody limbs in the corner, and Grant did not like the sight of blood. Ironic, one of the greatest generals, and he got sick at the sight of blood. Now, not during a battle, but after a battle. And he couldn't stand blood, so he always ate his meat almost like shoe leather. And so Grant couldn't sleep in his headquarters, so he found this large pine tree, and it was raining buckets. But he's sitting under his pine tree with his coat on, he's smoking his cigar, and Sherman walks up and was going to try to convince him to retreat. But Sherman said something in Sherman's memoirs. He said, something told me not to say that. And so he walked up to Grant and he said, well, Grant, because they knew each other from West Point. So they were friends from way back. He said, well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?
I know
And
this.
Grant nodded, took a puff of his cigar. He said, yep. And then he said, lick 'em tomorrow, though. And David Petraeus said that was what he would tell his troops at the darkest days in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that gave them courage to keep fighting and to win there in Iraq. So,
okay, you've convinced me now here where I was talking about broad brushstrokes about his leadership. Yeah, I can see it. Tell me about the end of the war comes, surrender at Appomattox, anything like particularly about that, and then into the politics or the political side, Lincoln's assassination and moving forward.
Lincoln met with Grant, Sherman, and Admiral Porter on what was called the River Queen. And you see that boat in the movie Lincoln. That's where they have their meetings on that boat with the Confederate entourage. And so that was one of their, private meeting places out on the James River. And Lincoln, who had been one of the great wrestlers of the Midwest, there was only one person who ever beat him, and he only beat him because he cheated. So he was a great wrestler. So he used a wrestling term in that meeting, and he said about the South, let them up easy. And that's just like after you've pinned somebody, you want to help them up as a gentleman. Let them up easy. He said, I don't want hangings. I don't want tribunals. If Jefferson Davis escapes the country while my back is turned, I won't mind that. Because remember, in context, the last great revolution and civil war would have been the French Revolution, where there was nothing but cutting off people's heads. It was madness. And Lincoln remembered that and said, we don't want this. And Grant totally agreed with that concept. So at Appomattox, the army or the cavalry under Sheridan got out in front of Lee and cut him off. The Appomattox River was to the north, the Army of the James was to the south, and the Army of the Potomac was behind them. So they were surrounded and they couldn't go anywhere. They did try to break out that morning. It was Palm Sunday. And as they got through the cavalry and they were pushing out, and all of a sudden they saw the field full of all these blue coats underneath the crest of the hill. And it was the Army of the James swarming in, and they knew that they had to surrender. They had no choice. And so when Grant went to meet with Lee in the home of Wilmer McLean in Appomattox, Grant came in and he was covered in mud because all of his uniform were way, way behind because they were racing to catch the Army of the Potomac, or the Army of the Northern Virginia. The last thing he was thinking about was a clean uniform. He
Sure.
wanted to nail these guys down and get them to surrender. And so later, people asked him, what was going through your mind as you were walking up the steps to meet General Lee? He said, I was embarrassed that I was covered in mud and I didn't have my sword. And I didn't want General Lee to think it was disrespectful, which I think is amazing. Another view into Grant's
Yeah.
soul. So he goes in, and Grant or Lee had said to Longstreet, they had asked him, "Sir, why are you wearing your very best uniform that he had kept clean, carrying in his wagon, and he had a jeweled sword? Why are you getting all dressed up for this?" And General Lee said to Longstreet and to the other officers there, "Well, I think I am to be General Grant's prisoner, and I need to make a good show of it." And so when these two titans come together, Grant was so laid back that Lee had to say, "General Grant, I think we're here to to surrender the Army of Northern Virginia." And Grant was like, "Oh, I'm sorry," because Grant wanted to put Lee at ease.
Mm.
And so then Lee said, "What are your terms?" And so Grant, basically verbally said what the terms were, and they were unbelievably generous terms. He said, basically, we want you to lay down your arms and then go back to your farms, and we will not harass you. So they brought a piece of paper. Lee said, "That's great. Please put it to paper." So Grant wrote this down, and he added a line that actually went beyond his authority as a general. But Lincoln didn't say anything about it. And it ended up being one of the most important phrases in American history. And that is, he wrote, "If the Confederate soldiers and officers will lay down their arms and go peaceably back to their farms and their homes, as long as they do not break the local laws or the laws of the government, they will not be harassed by the federal government." That was amnesty.
Yeah.
Now, that was tested. After Lincoln was assassinated, Johnson became president, Andrew Johnson. And Johnson was a Southerner. He was the governor of Tennessee, who became vice president, then became president. And he wanted retribution.
Okay.
He said all these people broke away and they need to be punished.
I want you to hold that thought, finish anything with the war, and then have a clean cut, and we'll talk about political side after that. Oh, by the way, I also want to add that for the record, that General Sheridan is my collateral kindred. He's my great grandfather's brother.
Oh my goodness.
Great grandfather. I don't remember exactly what it was. I'm not in his line, but collateral kindred means he's just like, I'm not his line, but like related.
You're in the family.
Like his father is also my line. So for whatever that worked.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what.
Nothing here. I just want to put that out there.
Sheridan was one of the greatest commanders we've ever had in American history.
He doesn't get a lot of play like everybody else, but as a cavalryman, holy cow!
He turned the tide, and Jeb Stuart was dead because of Sheridan.
Yeah.
Sheridan said to Meade, "Let me loose," because Meade was trying to control him. He said, "Let me loose and I will defeat the cavalry," which the Confederate cavalry had been just beating the Union cavalry every time. There was only one time right before Gettysburg at Brandy Station where the Union won. The rest of the time, the Southerners won every time. And so Meade was all upset, this usurper, and he goes to Grant saying, "This Sheridan guy, he's this and he's that." And he said he could go and whip the cavalry. And Grant said, "Did he really say that?" Meade said, "Yeah, he said that." And Grant said, "Well, usually when he says something, he means it. So order him to go do it." And he did. And within just 2 weeks, Jeb Stuart was dead.
Yep. And if I have my facts right about it was like essentially Grant and then Sherman and Sheridan and in about that order, as far as like who really, was successful on the Union side. So
absolutely correct.
Okay.
So this episode went overtime. Stay tuned. Come back again for part 2 in the next episode, and we'll hear about Grant as the president and what happened at the end of his life. Thanks for listening.